The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
First of all, we did case studies of 5 cities with reference to the 19th century primarily, and how they dealt with similar fundamentals of change. Any thoughts before we move on? Any comparisons that strike you? London, Paris, Barcelona, Vienna, and Chicago.
I think it's interesting with Paris and Vienna how the interventions were, in the end, more integrated into and sort of on top of what was there before.
Yeah.
Whereas Chicago is all new, and Barcelona, you have the medieval city and then the Southland as two completely separate.
Yeah. The Cerdà model, as I argued, is probably the most conventional model. That is, you leave the center of the city and its walls. Well, you take down the walls because everybody took down the walls. The taking down of the walls in Barcelona was before Cerdà's competition, so it was already moving in the direction of expansion. But the scale of Cerdà's expansion plan is phenomenal. How it is that a city, modest city, would undertake such an enormous expansion under such a rigid control is remarkable. It puts Barcelona in a category almost all of its own. Chicago's expansion was from 1830 onward. You built a house, you built another house, you built another house. There was no city involvement in the expansion of Chicago. It was purely a market-driven phenomenon.
But wasn't the grid where you could build that house already established through the government division of land?
Well, I don't know the history well enough to know what is government subdivision. It's a tract of land which is developed by a developer, often according to its. The weakness of Chicago's governance is significant in the history. It separates it out completely from the other cities. European urban control is much more significant than American urban control. Conzen has argued that the American layout often included larger pieces of land than was required. And this, he argued, was a good investment in that you could then double up or expand over time. Seeing how only half the lot was built, you could double up the density, for instance. I did a studio project many years ago here in Cambridgeport, where I argued that one could densify it without changing the existing buildings, but there was enough space to do new innovation. And the reality of the situation is that Cambridgeport is absolutely resistant to any plan which densifies its area, for one reason mainly: automobile traffic. You cannot in Newton, if you have built yourself a palace and have another lot free, you cannot even rent out another property. because of the fear of an increase in density of automobiles.
But that is changing right now. I mean, slowly, but the fight over laneway housing, they're calling it.
Yeah, it may over time. I don't know whether ownership of property sets up a greater lack of indulgence in change. Pullman, Illinois was an example of him not wanting to let home ownership exist because he felt that home ownership would stand in the way of the people changing their psychological apparatus and living much cleaner lives, as he as a paternalist wanted. I don't know. I was just reading again about EUR. Do you know EUR 1942? Michela, you know what EUR stands for? Yeah. Esposizione Nazionale, no, Esposizione Universale Roma. EUR was intended as a fascist commemoration exposition 20 years after the origins of fascism in Italy under Mussolini. Anyway, we'll deal a bit later with this. I want to now shift gears a bit and do 3 classes which reflect backwards on these case studies. The first one today deals with a very difficult proposition, and that is the expression of power. The second one on Thursday will deal with utopianism, because the 19th century was a very hotbed of utopian attempts to change the form and social structure of cities. And thirdly, I will conclude this section by looking at England, the new towns proposition in England after the 46 war, and Russia between 1917 and 1932, pre-Stalinist Russia, as examples of attempts to counter the problems that the 19th century city provided, in a sense. I think the material I'm doing today and the next 2 classes suggests much more interaction with you. I would want your opinion on things which I'm going to propose, difficult things, things which are very difficult to establish in fact. I start off with a quotation. In 16th century Paris, a popular form of entertainment was cat burning, in which a cat was hoisted on a sling on a stage and slowly lowered into a fire. According to historian Norman Davies, the spectators, including kings and queens, shrieked with laughter as the animals, howling in pain, were singed, roasted, and finally demolished. Such sadism would be unspeakable in today. Another French example. Damien, the incompetent would-be assassin of Louis XV. Louis XV was an incompetent man himself. He had an incompetent assassin, Damien. He was sentenced to be torn to pieces by 6 horses, to be stabbed and have his wounds salved with burning sulfur and molten lead, and a good deal more in the same vein. Why don't we do that anymore? According to the best writer on the subject, Michel Foucault, in his book Discipline and Punish, we have substituted hard measures for soft measures. And in his view, soft measures introduced by liberal society, where punishment is less obvious and less brutal, is nevertheless curtailing of freedom in society. So let's look at that proposition a little more. Let's look at the proposition of the facade in architecture. And then let's look at 2 case studies. The one of the proposed 5-mile rebuilding of the center of Berlin by Albert Speer and Hitler, in which we find some very interesting components of ideology which one might relate to fascism or not. And the other example is the 2.5-mile avenue in St. Petersburg in Russia, the Nevsky Prospect, named after Alexander Nevsky, who was a 19-year-old leader of Russia, defeated the invading forces from the north many years ago. So let's start with the soft, the replacement of the hard with the soft. Let's look at, first of all, at a couple of characteristics of the 19th century which appear in these cases. First of all, the enlightenment of people as individuals, the specialization of places, the work which shows how the integrated house, which include craftsmen families and all together in the medieval guild, was replaced by separate rooms and typologies of houses, special places for servants, upstairs, downstairs in the British movies, row houses for workers, and most importantly, separation of work and home. The journey to work becomes a phenomenon of contemporary society. It still is. In the plan of the salt mining, salt processing town of Chaux, C-H-A-U-X, built in the late 18th century in France, you will see there are houses for blue-collar workers and houses for white-collar workers. There's a typology associated with each, and Ledoux, who designed Chaux, the architect of the Ancien Regime, I will show you a house for an intellectual that he designed. Imagine conceiving of a project of a house for an intellectual. There's a typology associated with each category of human beings. The concept of typology has stuck with architectural thought. It's been revived in our own times, but in a different kind of sense. When we'll talk about Aldo Rossi, we'll go back into the contemporary meaning of the typological experiment. A second characteristic of 19th century space was the organization of complex space. The first census in 1801 in England, the use of the cadastral system for measuring land, maps of boundaries and ownership, specialized sewage plans, and the capacity of a new management to organize complex space. Thirdly, new forms for institutions. Here we go back to our story about punishment. Power no longer needs to be violent. Killing no longer needs to be symbolic and public. The guillotine is used for the last time in 1789, I think, more or less. Torture is no longer visible. Yeah, I'm generalizing. Modern society attempts to teach you to reform and change your habits rather than persecuting you. In order to do that, you have the new idea of Panopticism. Panopticism being a system where an individual is watched from a central position, but doesn't know when he or she is being watched. A series of louvers separates the prisoners. The prisoners are isolated from each other so they cannot communicate. The prisoners are either workers, schoolboys, or madmen. Light enters from the outside and creates a silhouette which allows the person doing the envisioning, to see the person being watched. I quote from Foucault, the prisoner is seen, but he does not see. He's the object of information, never a subject in communication. Power should be visible but unverifiable. Institutions can now move forward from being dungeons to being light structures. A new prison preserves only the enclosure but eliminates the need to deprive the patients of light or to hide them. No bars, no chains, no heavy locks. Fortress-like architecture is replaced by economic geometry. This is parallel with taking down the city walls. You know what a panopticon looks like. I've just described it in words. Shall I draw one on a... Oh, can you imagine what this is? Yeah, of course. I'm sorry, I forget what I'm doing. There are many variations on them. Those are two from Mexico, I think. Elaborate structures, all maintaining a certain central idea that you can watch a patient or schoolboy or a prisoner without locking him up, in the sense of using heavy instruments for preserving his security. According to Foucault, this creates an environment in which institutions of health, institutions of production, I will talk about the salt extraction city Shaw, near Switzerland, 1775, 1779, and so on and so on. Foucault uses the analogy of what happens during the plague. This is fairly long. I'm going to go through it very quickly. When the plague appears in a town at the end of the 17th century, first the strict spatial partition, the closing of the town and its outlying districts, prohibition to leave the town on pain of death, the killing of all stray animals, to the division of the town into distinct quarters, each governed by an intendant. Each street is played, and he goes on and on about the details of how food is distributed, the powers of each street superintendent. Death is often the punishment inflicted on somebody who doesn't obey. It is a segmented, immobile, frozen space. Each individual is fixed in his place, and if he moves, he does so at the risk of his life, contagion, or punishment. He analogizes this with the panopticon space. This enclosed segmented space, observed at every point in which the individuals are inserted in a fixed place, in which the slightest movements are supervised, in which all events are recorded, in which an uninterrupted work of writing links the center and periphery. Power is exercised without division, according to a continuous hierarchical figure. All this constitutes a compact model of the disciplinary mechanism. It's interesting that the possible outcomes of contravening the orthodox environment of the plague superimposed upon a place, if he moves, he does so at the risk of his life, contagion, or punishment. Three awful results. In the sense that one requires a specialization of types as well as a sense of geometry of control, one can find no better example than the salt extraction factory at Shaw. Shall I draw it or not here? Actually, I need two of these blocks. The gate and the director's house on axis. The geometry is that the director has the word is gaze. G-A-Z-E. Over the workers who live on the edges. Nobody knows whether the director is watching or not. The trick is that you're constantly under the threat of being supervised. The gate is decorated on the outside, not on the inside. What that means, I don't know.
The decoration isn't for the workers?
No. The decoration is for whoever gazes from the outside. Blue-collar workers, reverse. White-collar workers, blue-collar workers. This is a crude diagram of a factory town, one of the first factory towns ever built. In fact, it may be the first one on record prior to the 18th century. Have you seen this plan before? Where did you run into it?
I think in studying this same town.
Yeah. So you have a typology of specialized space for categories of people. You have a typology and a location in the geometry for the director. You have the automatic, constant and subtle examination process by the director of the now these could be a bunch of children being watched in a laboratory through a screen which makes them not realize that they're being watched. Oh, sorry, the Louvre system would be the light would reflect the people back to the central observer. Okay, enough of the bad drawing. We'll see in the pictures some more detailed examples of Shaw. A French contemporary writer by the name of Paul Virilio, I don't know if you ever run into any of his writing, we extend this notion of inconspicuous examination to the contemporary city. If you want an example of somebody who's applied it to the American city, there's a thesis done in 1989 by Daniel Glenn called The Mall Society, Inclusion, Exclusion and Control in the Urban Center. I think he does a case study of the John Hancock building and a couple of examples of where insidious control is maintained whilst done in a very elegant, signifying way. Virilio writes a piece called The Overexposed City, which I'm not sure I agree with completely. But he says that we should be conscious of the fact that our behavior is now examined and processed through environmental controls which are subtle and not so obvious. Take the question of congestion control. Congestion control implies that your movement in an automobile has to be rationed. Therefore, you pay a fee when you pass a cordon of a kind. That fee is processed by virtue of you having some identification tag on your car, electronic identification tag on your car. It happens on the Mass Turnpike if you live beyond the Mass Turnpike entrance to the center city. The objection to congestion pricing has often been that it locates you in space without you being aware that it's happening. If a telephone bill arrives at home and your wife says, "Where have you? I see that you were on the main road in the city at 2 o'clock in the morning of Thursday the 22nd. What were you doing there?" And you stumble and say, "Well, it's a mistake. I wasn't there. The truth is I was visiting my girlfriend." It's a set of controls which can be elaborated enormously and deprive you of your individual liberty. That issue will continue to exert its force on the control system. The amount of freedom that we will give up in order for us to maintain a sane environment is at issue. I remember being on a small group here at MIT where one of the famous computer control people was on the panel, and he made the statement of the following kind: he could reduce murder in the society by at least 50% by having everybody forcibly wear a bracelet which located them in space. The fact that you can locate yourself freely in space is, of course, subvented by a control system of a kind. But a liberal control system will not maintain your position in space as a record. Some of you may not care whether whether your movements are controlled in space or not. The payoff of the declining rate of murder, to the extent that everybody who commits a murder can be located in space, it's an intriguing trade-off. And the modern city is going to increasingly, the modern society, Virilio and others, Foucault amongst others, argues that it's going to become more and more pervasive phenomenon in the contemporary city. These are maybe symbolic as well as actual phenomena. I go on to another aspect of this story, and that's a piece of writing by David Friedman, who is a professor here in the history area. Friedman argues that the medieval street was a functioning street. In other words, that it maintained the processes of commerce, expansion of individuals into the street, random affairs, loose furniture, a whole range of things characterized the medieval street. Not only was the medieval street a street of multi-use, its facades which enclosed the street were democratized and varied. It is not until the Renaissance that street and palace, and this statement is also true for modest domestic architecture, were set into the more or less symbiotic relationship in which they continue until the 20th century. What he's saying is the word fasciata the façade of a building or a street plays the same role, expressive role, as the head does in the human body. It is the face of what you see and implies meanings which the street is meant to produce towards its users. There were rules in the medieval street system for how many movable objects you were allowed to attach to a house or shop. Movable tables or carts are potentially so disruptive to the social communal order were explicitly banned later on. We still make arrangements around the use of the street in Italian streets, in Italian piazza, in summer. In this country, we have now introduced the possibility of doing it even in the city of Boston. Prior to recently, it was not possible to do it in Boston because of health legislation. Only a healthy place could only be considered healthy if it maintained certain proprietary sanitary laws. Now there's a relationship possible between the use of the street as a temporary device while maintaining the facade of the street. There are transactions, for instance, in the new hotel, on the relatively new hotel on the waterfront. There's an arrangement whereby the hotel looks after that park that's been created, in return of which it may serve drinks on the terrace outside its own property. The emergence of the facade, however, as a factor is interesting. It promotes the expression of meaning differently from an improperly organized environment. Other than loose furniture, it was also possible above 10 feet to project your house into the street itself to gain more space. So there was a variety of disruptions in the medieval street to the orthodoxy, the constant orthodoxy of the street. The orthodoxy of the street being non-facade driven. According to Friedman, this changed. And you have, for the first time, the organization of the street facade, largely for palaces and large domestic environments, as being constant. He cites the 1444 Medici Palace in Florence, recognized as the first great palace of the Renaissance. He goes on to argue about its effect. Facade then represents a new relationship between buildings in the city. It is a concept born in the 14th century and matured in the Renaissance. It argues, if he's correct, in a changed identification of the effect of the built world on individual behavior. Under the Aztecs, the street of the dead in Teotihuacan didn't have constant facades, but it had pyramids of the moon and the sun, and there were strict notions of behavior along an axis. the two projects which I want to look at with you use the Friedman idea of the facade as a powerful tool in different ways. Hitler's ideology was in part based on the permanence of power. The EUR in 1942 under Mussolini was merely an exhibition. It later became a town, or part of Rome, the southeast part of Rome. Under Hitler, there was no end to the permanence of power. Power was constant and everlasting. There's a wonderful story that Speer tells of working in Nuremberg and seeing a building being taken down and looking at the ruins and saying, we must not have ruins as ugly as this. So he invents something called the theory of ruined value. Imagine a theory which forces you to make sure that the permanence of your situation is going to be beyond the life of the building, that the ruins will ruin like great ruins of Caracalla or the great Roman ruins. This is only one example of an ideology which is not temporary, but which is seen to be permanent. The style of buildings is considered to be neo-empire. Again, it's got to do with everlasting circumstance. According to Speer, they start with the Doric order and keep on inventing new orders as they go along. Again, Hitler is the beginning of a continuity. Hitler himself says to Albert Speer, whom he chooses as his architect when Speer is 26 or 24 or something, he says, I need somebody who will understand when I'm dead. Meaning again that the normal projection of nature, of life, death, ruin, change, is disestablished. There are a number of examples of it. Hitler hated glass. Glass was too ephemeral. The 1936 games were Hitler's great triumph, international triumph. And he had a stadium which was being modernized with glass and so on. He hated it and told them to stop and put back the stone. Speer, in his spare time, designed a stadium for 400,000 people, which is an impossible artifact anyway. You cannot have 400,000 people in a place and have them see. The distances become too long, and but when Speer shows Hitler this model, Speer apologizes and says, I'm sorry, Herr Führer, the Olympic Games will not be able to be held in this stadium because the rules, I've changed the base of the platform so that the games, according to its present rules, will have to change. Hitler says, don't worry. The 1944 games are supposed to be in Tokyo. After that, they will return to Berlin and be held here forever. Forever, meaning forever. meaning, and at the same time, of course, we will change the Olympic rules. We will change the process in order to secure the fundamental fact of the construction. So you get his idea, the ideology expressed in terms of an interminable notion of continuity. No end is in sight. This is manic, it's anti-natural. We strive like hell to keep things going, but none of us have Leviathan ideas about infinite time, unless we are so obsessed with the inability to control nature, such as death. The second set of relationships between spatial performance and the physical form, spatial performance and the physical form resonating with this ideology, is the comparison system. Speer constantly talks about comparing things. He talks about a project he's doing for Hitler, which is 2,300 feet by 3,400 feet. He says, oh well, Darius I, one of the great rulers of Persia in the, I forget, the 5th century BC probably, yeah, 5th, only had 1,500 feet by 800 feet. He says we will erect a tower. Nero had a tower of 119 feet. The Statue of Liberty is 151 feet. Our Hitler statue will be 197 feet. When Leni Riefenstahl, who made the great film Olympia, asked for more money from Goebbels, and then Hitler, who was a great protagonist that they make this film, she said, look, 1932 Olympic Games were in Los Angeles. That's where Hollywood controls the world of film. They couldn't make a movie. All they did was still photographs. We need to show the world that we are superior. And she made this extraordinary film. The film starts off, has anybody seen Olympia? Yeah. You know.
A lot of the techniques she used on the Triumph of the Wheels.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. One of the interesting things too is the, what is the other? My mind just slips. I'll think of it in a while. This comparison notion. There was also ideology in the film. The film starts with pictures of static Greek sculptures which slowly start moving, and they turn into a trip, a running trip between Olympia in Greece and Berlin, the first carrying of the flame ever in the Olympic Games, the modern Olympic Games. That represents not only a move from the Aryan world of Greece to the modern Aryan world of Hitler, but it also indicates a connection in the film between why Hitler has the shepherd who won the marathon in 1896 in the Athens Games on the stand with him in 36 when he opens the Games. The ideology of this regime is amazing. It is consistent and very adventurous. Speer became the Minister of Munitions towards the end of the war and talks in his book about the relationship between how much money it costs to build and how much money it costs to destroy. It's interesting again that he would put that into perspective as the Reich was declining, and it was clear to him that they were going to fail. Another comparison which is interesting, comparisons go on forever. One of the major buildings at the north axis of the new center for Berlin is a domed hall. This domed hall is 825 feet diameter, which is colossal. St. Peter's would fit into it a couple of times. 150,000 people could be accommodated standing. How do you get to such a size? Well, Hitler thought it necessary to explain to me that the size of meeting halls should be governed by medieval conceptions. In the cathedral town of Ulm, for instance, in southern Germany, 30,000 square feet of area when there were only 15,000 people living in Ulm. If you use that relationship, 150,000 people or size hall for a city of a few million people is absolutely correct. There's a tendency in professional practice to constantly demonstrate relationships. I do it all the time. I am embarrassed often when I'm doing it. I'll say, this is 3/4 of the length of the last highway which was built under Roosevelt, or whatever. It establishes for your clients a kind of sense of location, in time. It's often foolish. What is the relationship between Eisenhower's building of roads and a modern road? But comparisons have a funny kind of effect. They stabilize, they put you in touch with a realm larger than your own realm. Often that's for a fascist a great achievement that he's actually Hitler speaks elegantly of his visits to the Vienna Opera when he was a student. He talks about Garnier's interior of the French Opera when he visits Paris in 1940. There's the constant notion that if you are in a position of power, you have to not only relate yourself to other people who've been in a position of power, but you have to exceed them. There's an algorithm which moves in the direction of larger, better, different, more powerful, and so on. So Nazism was as much the ideology as expressed in spatial terms was as much to do with an evolutionary idea that we are not here, we are here to change time. We are to influence time, and we're going to do it through spatial comparison. If you look at this map, the large 150,000 technologists have done Hitler actually put on the foundations for some of these buildings. And environmental engineers now calculate that this dome building with 150,000, 180,000 people in it, it would start raining inside the building because of the it would have to be air conditioned to take care of the advent of rain. You'll see some curious things. There are cinemas, there are opera houses, there are concert halls, all spread throughout, from this railway station in the bottom through the Triumphal Arch, which was borrowed from Napoleon, but many times bigger than Napoleon. It has millions of signatures on it. There's a Philharmonic Hall. Berlin still has the best Philharmonic Orchestra in the world. The Reichsopera is next door. There's a hotel. There are various number of hotels. There are restaurants. There are museums. There's a large amount of culture built into the system. Except for residents and industry, it virtually produces all the forms of a town, all the uses of a town. What's wrong with this? Could you imagine this being built, and after the war, the ruler is imprisoned or dies, and this is taken over by a new liberal city of Berlin, and Starbucks is located somewhere, and the Pritzker Hotel family are in here somewhere. We reuse elements of our spatial world which have punished people in the past. We think very little of taking an old prison and modifying it into residential accommodation today, although there's a little bit of a stigma attached. But there's no stigma attached to taking a church, Christian church, and making it into a restaurant in Newton. So transformability is possible under all circumstances. Could something at this 5-mile scale be transformable over time, partially in part? Could a post-Nazi environment ever be changed formally? You go to one of the buildings in the world I like most, the Ducal Palace in Urbino. If you go into the basement, you see the qualities that the servants must have endured in crushing ice for this great ducal family. I don't evaluate the Ducal Palace on the basis of the tragic condition of the labor which must have kept the place in order. So what are your standards? Memory plays a part in this. Memory is kept alive through monuments, memorials. We'll do a class on memory later on in this class because it's become a much more interesting aspect of this discourse. There's no memory embedded in this project. Schinkel is not reintroduced or played upon spatially. It's an ultimate controlled environment. For Jews and gay people and gypsies and others who suffered enormously under the process of this regime, it's difficult to talk about this without involving procedural questions. There's a wonderful book in the Holocaust literature on oh gosh, what's the town? The death camp in Poland on the... No, it's not one of those. It's far to the east. It's oh Christ. Treblinka. There's a book by a man called Steiner whose parents died in Treblinka. He interviewed some of the old people who escaped from Treblinka towards the end of its life. And he asked the question which is often asked of the Jews, why they didn't rebel, why they just took it all. And he tells the story of this being the phenomenon in Treblinka until a certain point, around 1940 or somewhere, where they started worrying that maybe they weren't going to, the Nazi regime was not going to survive. And they started taking down buildings, rebuilding them as parks, planting grass, putting up hedges, planting trees. And the Jews at that point couldn't take it any longer. They were afraid that the memory of the death situation would not be, there would be no evidence. And on that basis, they engineered the first revolt. Most of them were killed. So the whole issue of memory, how long it maintains itself, is the memory of this building system separable from the memory of the ideology which perpetrated death? These are questions of meaning which are very difficult to deal with. Let's look briefly, very briefly at the regime of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, the Nevsky Prospect is one arm of of three spokes which emanate from the center at the water. You've got a plan in front of you. The plan is anchored at its beginning by two connections. The one to Alexander, to the cemetery of Alexander Nevsky, the 19-year-old who saved Russia in 1240 from invasion from the north. The other one is to the interior of Moscow, to the interior of Russia and Moscow. The axis on which the building ends is the Admiralty building. Peter was obsessed with water and ships. When he became Tsar towards the end of the 18th century, he tried to build a Russian fleet which could go down the Volga and towards the Black Sea. He was beaten up and failed. He then turned to Europe, and this was one of his openings to Europe. He shifted He never liked Moscow because, like Louis the XV, one of his relatives was killed in Moscow in the Kremlin. He then did one of the most manic things ever done. That's try to build a city. The equivalent of it northward would be like the United States like building its capital on Hudson Bay. It's so far north. The word Neva is a swamp in Finnish. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the building of this strange city. He had to impose taxes on people entering the city that they had to carry stones with them. It's a remarkable story. Its axis is between the water, the Admiralty building, and the history of Russia. There are two crossing water bodies, the Fontanka and the Moika. The Moika is where, in one of the days of the 1917 revolution, the mob came down the street and there were the Russian Tsarist military waiting for them at this point. And in a significant gesture, the Russian military didn't fire on the mob. There is today a cinema on that point called the Barricada Cinema. So this is an environment much older than Hitler's, but where time has already intervened and changed the use. Many of the great palaces, the Brezilevsky Palace, the Stroganov Palace, the Mikhailevsky Palace, are now museums. St. Petersburg has a higher proportion of square footage in museums as opposed to population than any city in the world, largely because of the takeover of so many of the great palaces under Sovietism. The water is constantly a factor. There's a bypass on the left close to the Fontanka River, back to the water. And there's another one close to Dostvaya Square where the road has a bypass to the water. On the building of the public library, the Duma, which is the city hall, the Kazan church, a bookstore, a ladies' store, the Passage, the Holland church, almost everything that the Alexander Theatre, public library, so on. What about Alexander Nevsky? Peter the Great Tsar was a cruel man. He imposed no liberty on his civilian population. He built a city at enormous cost. Nevsky prospect, unlike Hitler's, is anchored in Russian history. It's modern history related to the water and to Alexander built built the beginnings of the Russian army and the Russian navy. It's another, first of all, it has mixed uses on it. Well, so does Hitler's. I just spoke about the number of cinemas and performance halls. So that doesn't distinguish the two. What distinguishes between the two roads as expressions? The reference to Hitler's practice of ideological practice renders his treatment of the center Berlin highly suspect. You cannot divorce the two. Over time, who knows what will happen to the memory of Hitler. In another 100 years, Auschwitz will be as much of a building to be visited by the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the people who died. This is the first panopticon of Bentham, the British liberal, who I conceived of the idea. Next. Plan for shipyards, again, where a controlling system emanates from a central position. Next, different. Lecture on the evils of alcoholism in the auditorium of Fresnay prison. Yes, prison in Illinois. Not many American panopticon prisons were built. Next. Mexico seemed to be very keen to the revised panopticon is on the right is a national stamp. Next. Sure. Original plans. Arche Salin on the left and right. Next. The built part. The fact that you can see the director's house at the back at the same time as you enter, the connection between the two. Next. Decoration of the director's house. Next. And these are two other projects by Ledoux. This is a house for an intellectual. Again, a typological exhibit for a character consideration of a person as a type. What is different between a house of an intellectual, other than you may have a large library, and any other house? Here's a maison de plaisir, a kind of pleasure palace, again with a kind of central and centripetal organization. Next. The extension of this idea, this is the hospital in Paris, as it's grown over time, added onto by piece by piece by piece. This is a competition entry for rebuilding of it. Now there are two dominant forces. The one is the church at the top, the other one is the entry at the bottom. Everything else is segmented and fixed in place and open to observation. Behavior is now frozen as it is in the Panopticon. Next. The same device for children's school and an example of the separation of house and work, each being a domain which is individually separated from the other. Next. Hitler did much of the drawing himself. Here he's in Paris in 1940 with Speer next to him. Next. Did this art student's failure change history? Well, yes. This is Hitler's own drawing of the large domed hall. Next, the Arch of Triumph and the access to the domed hall, and this 400-foot wide avenue on either side. The decorations of the avenue, all with guns. Next. So you've got them. Okay. Hitler's sketch of a triumphal arch. He could draw quite well. Next. The Nevsky Prospect, the yellow stripe on the leading for the Admiralty building to Alexander Nevsky. The other two spokes added later lead to the barricades, to the army. Okay, next. We'll go for a walk down the street. This is the Nevsky Prospect with the Admiralty building at the end, day and night. Next. This is the railway station hotel to Moscow, to the center of the country. Next. A small church which is turned into a subway stop. Next. The Fontanka water crossing, one of the Anichev Palace on the left. Next, the Brezolevsky Palace, the Passage store. Next, it's not the Alexander Library. This is the Alexander Library on a small road which leads off the prospect to the water. Next. The Duma, the central city headquarters. Next. The Duma. Sorry, this is the Kazan Cathedral. Next. I'll just give you a sense of the enclosure of the facades. Next. The Moika crossing, the Barakata Cinema, the bypass to the Tortsvaya Square on the right. Next. Dostoevsky said, St. Petersburg is the most intentional and abstract city in history. Dostoevsky was in prison across the river. I'll start on Thursday finishing this story, just raising some questions about what this all means.